Hi, welcome back to my channel for this week and to my second video in Roxy's Journal of Stitchery. So this week what we're going to be doing is we're going to be focusing on showing you how to do some of the basic embroidery stitches that you might like to use in your Journal of Stitchery if you choose to make one. So here are two samples of stitcheries for the first week that I've done. I'm going to show you how to do the first 5 stitches, which I'll run through in a minute. And then Rachel's video is going to release a little bit later than mine. I think it was going to be half an hour later than mine. And she's going to show you the next 5. So that's 10 stitches in total for this week. And then next week we're going to release another video with the next 10 stitches. So by the end of next week's videos, we will have shown you 20 different stitches that we like to use. So a few people have asked about the dimensions of the books that we're using. Rachel and I are going to use different books. My book here has a spine of, it's just a little bit over 1.5 inches. And we think that 1.5 inches would probably be the minimum that you would want to use. So this book here will be quite good because it'll just be big enough that my slow stitch pieces will fit in there, and if it does expand a little bit I can always tie a bit of sari silk around it to keep it closed. So I'm using a Reader's Digest, and then you've seen that Rachel's using an old Italian book. So today what we're focusing on is the sampler stitches. So I'm just showing you here. This is one I did last week. Just have a look at it. Sorry, I could move it a bit further up. That's better. So you can see some of the stitches there. We've got running stitch, back stitch, things like that. And so today I'm focusing on these first 5 stitches. So we've got running stitch, which is these 3 rows at the top. Then we've got a whipped running stitch, which you can see I'm pointing to right now. We've got back stitch. I've done a few rows of that there. We've got stem stitch, which is just that sort of bulky one there, and then we've got split stitch. So they are going to be the first 5 stitches that I'm going to show you how to do today, and hopefully you'll be able to practice these a little bit. Don't worry if your stitching is wonky. Look at mine. Mine's not straight, it's wonky. I'm not a perfect stitcher. Rachel is not a perfect stitcher. We're a little bit wonky. I consider us to be rustic stitchers. So what I've done is I've got my little background piece, this white piece of fabric, and I'm just measuring it out. And I'm working out that I'm going to start my stitching about half an inch down from the top and half an inch down from the side. So I've got a pencil here, a ruler, and I'm just putting dots. That's half an inch in and half an inch down from the top. So 1 on each side, and then I'm also doing 1 in the middle. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do little pencil dots, half an inch apart the whole way down the page, so that I can stitch between those dots and try and keep my stitching fairly straight. Okay, it's not going to be perfectly straight. I'm not drawing lines with the pencil. I'm just doing 3 dots as a guide to try and keep myself straight. So you'll see that I do that now. So I'm just using a simple lead pencil. You won't see it because I'll actually stitch over the top of it, so you're not going to see the dots. You might like to use a different type of pen, like an erasable ink pen, that will disappear. I don't really want to use the ones that you wet because sometimes the dye in the threads can run, and you wouldn't really want it running onto your little sampler because it won't look very good. Okay, so now you can see on my page I'm just finishing off the center dots, and I've got that completely done. So just to give you an idea of different needles that you can use, this is a chenille needle. I do a lot of my embroidery with this chenille needle, either a size 18 or a number 20. It has a fairly large hole, so it's easy to thread. And now I'm going to show you, this is called a quilter's knot. So you hold the tail of the thread point running down the needle, and then I just wrap it 2 or 3 times around, more times if it's a thinner thread, and then I slide the thread down the needle and all the way down the thread to the end. So that's what we call a quilter's knot. And you can see, just tighten it up there. And that is what I use to hold my thread in place. Now, some embroiderers who are experienced don't do a knot at all. They actually have the thread at the back and kind of stitch over it. But I don't do that. I'm not too worried about having knots because you're not going to see them once I sew this into the book. So we're starting with our first stitch. So I just pull it through the hole, and this is the running stitch here that I'm going to show you how to do. This is also used, I'm just showing you a few places here on a block that Mum did where she's done running stitch. You can't see it too well on that blue, but there is running stitch there. The orange thread along the side is just a simple running stitch, and she's also got some white cotton running stitches on the white piece and the yellow running stitch, and on the dark pieces she's got running stitch as well, but you can't see it, but it adds a lovely texture. And this is what a lot of people use in their slow stitching, is just that simple running stitch. Now here's a block that my sister made me, and there is some running stitch in different directions in different places on this block that she made. So I'm just showing you a few more examples of how you'd use running stitch. So that stitching down of the fabric is kind of a Indian cantha quilt kind of stitching. Also, the Japanese use some of their running stitching like in the Boro style quilts that they made. So this is a very ancient technique and very simple. So we just come up from the back, we make a small stitch, and then I come up a little bit further. I'm going to show you this multiple times just so you get the idea of what I'm doing. Okay, so I'm just pulling the thread through, and you can see I've made a small stitch, and I've come up again ready to make my second stitch. Hopefully you can see this well enough. I'm not that zoomed in, but I will lift it up every now and again and show you. So you can do a single stitch like I've just done, straight under, and then straight back up from the bottom to the top. And then I'm going to show you how you can do multiple stitches at once. So we go through the fabric down and then back up, and then you can go down again, just trying to space your stitches approximately the same width apart and at the same length. So I'm not going to have perfectly even stitches, but they're okay. They're not too bad. And to be honest, I don't like things to be perfect. Neither does Rachel. You can see they're not absolutely perfect, but they're coming along quite nicely. And then what I want to do is I actually want to stitch onto that pencil dot, so it's keeping me in my straight line, and I'm also covering it up with the thread so you won't see it when I'm done. So now I'm just finishing off this first row, going down through the fabric and back up, doing that running stitch until I get to the end, and I will end up covering that little pencil dot. So the type of thread, this first thread that I'm using is called a perle cotton, and it is size 8, which is a fairly standard size that you get in perle cotton. This is a thread where I wouldn't actually split the fibers, I just use the cotton as it is. And then to finish it off at the back, I just loop my needle under one of those stitches, and then I do it for a second time, and then I'm going to show you I go back through the little hole, the little circle, and I pull it tight, and I do that 2 or 3 times just to secure that thread, and then I can snip it off. So I'm just starting a second line of running stitch. I'm using a thicker cotton. It's like a hand-dyed cotton. So I'm making my quilter's knot right now, running the thread down the needle, wrapping it around a few times and pulling that knot to the end until it's secure. So this thread is like a cotton yarn that you can buy at stores that have knitting supplies, and they're hand dyed different colors. Like there's a variety of colors in the yarn, and they're not evenly dyed like you'd buy a DMC thread that's fairly evenly dyed, because they're probably commercially dyed. These are actually hand dyed yarns, and I love using them in my stitching because it's interesting to give some different sort of colours that come through. So you can see that's got a bit of pink, and then we've got a few bits of brown on it, and it's got some aqua on it as well. So there's different colours that run through that thread. So flipping to the back and running my thread under that first stitch, and then looping it through the hole a couple of times before I snip it off. So now it's time for our second stitch, which is a whipped running stitch. So you start off with the basic running stitch line. And I'm just going to show you, it looks like this one with the blue, and I've whipped it with a pink variegated thread. And so what I've done is I've done a couple of extra running stitch lines there, you can see. And what I do is I come up just at the end of one of the running stitches where I first started my running stitch line. So I'm using a contrasting colour. So you can't see that one too well. It's like a light yellow, and then I'm using a pale aqua. And all I'm going to do is I'm going through each step. So I'm kind of one little wrap through. So just have a look again. So from the top, underneath that stitch, down to the bottom. I'm not actually pulling this piece of thread to the back of the fabric. Can you see how that's just wrapped it? So I'm coming through that running stitch from top down to the bottom and pulling my thread through. Top, down to the bottom, and pulling my thread through. So I pretty much do that. Sorry, it keeps getting hooked on the edge of the fabric. I pretty much do that the whole way to the end. So just speeding up my video again so you can watch me get to the end. So top to bottom, top to bottom, top through to the bottom, top through to the bottom, and then top through to the bottom. And again, I just put my needle back through the hole where I finished the running stitch. So I'm just going to whip one more of the running stitch lines just to show you one more time. If you feel like you've got the hang of this, you can always just forward through the section of the video. I usually show everything at least twice. So this thread that I'm using here is just a stranded DMC cotton, which I'm using, I think it's 3 strands I split apart. If you want it thicker, you could leave all 6, it's up to you. So here are our first 2 stitches. We've got a simple running stitch and a whipped running stitch as well. Now we are up to stitch number 3, which is going to be back stitch. So on this previous sample, back stitch just looks like a straight line of stitches. Not so straight, mine's a bit wonky, but anyway. So what we do is we're going to thread up our needle again, making our quilter's knot, coming in where the pencil dot is, and we make our first stitch, which is exactly the same as the running stitch. So just straight through the fabric to the back, and we've made one simple stitch. Then we're going to come up, just like we do with the running stitch, a little bit ahead, but instead of stitching forward, we're going to go back into the hole where our first stitch finished. That's why it's called back stitch, because you do your stitch and then you come back. So again, we're going to go forward a little bit, and then we're going to go back into the previous hole. So we're making like a straight line of stitches. Now you might be thinking, what length do we make our stitches? Well, that is completely up to you. So mine would be, they're probably about 3 mils long, three maybe 4 mils long, millimeters that is. It'd be a little bit less than 1/4 of an inch. but you can make them smaller or slightly larger. Smaller, obviously you need to be nice and neat and can be quite small. If you can't see too well, like me, you need glasses, like I've got glasses, and my sister does too. And then larger, you can definitely do larger stitches. You just do them the length that you like the look of. I've kept all my stitches in my samples fairly similar. Okay, so I'm going to speed up the video now just so you can see me finishing off this first line of backstitch. So hopefully you've got the idea of this one. And again, I'm using one of those hand-dyed cotton yarns. I will use them quite a bit in this. In fact, on this sample piece that I'm using here, I use a lot of different types of fibers, different threads and different colors deliberately, just so you can see how different things look, and then you can decide for yourself what you like the look of. So I like the variegation in the colors in these threads. I'm also someone who likes a lot of color. As you can see, all the threads in front of me on my table, very colorful. I do a mix of colors, and in fact I'm going to bring out a neon acrylic wool and do one of the stitches with that as well. So just fast forwarding myself a little bit, just because it's a bit boring watching me just stitch away. I'm just getting towards the end of my row here. And now I'm done, and there's my wonky row of backstitch. So I will show you one more time how to do it. This time I'm using quite a thick wool. This is, sorry, I'm off screen there. This is a tapestry wool in a bright purple. So showing you that you can use different fibers. This one would give obviously a thicker look. Just forwarding to the end of this line, and you can see that that wool gives a slightly thicker look. So 3 stitches down and 2 to go. This is stitch number 4, which is set stem stitch. It looks a bit like a rope when you're done. I'll just show you on my original sampler that I did. It's just there. Okay, so just like with running stitch, we're going to come up through the fabric and we are going to make a stitch. Okay, but what I've done this time is I've done a stitch. I've come through the fabric and just gone back a little bit. Did you see what I do? So coming down, and what you do, you make a stitch forward and you come back to the previous stitch. You'll see what it looks like in a minute. So we come forward a little bit and we come back to the end of the previous stitch. Then pull the thread through. So coming forward, I'm probably doing quite a small stitch there, maybe about 2 to 3 mils, and then back to the end of the previous stitch. Forward and back. Okay, speeding up the video to make this a bit quicker, I just continue with the exact same technique until I get to the end. So forwarding it to the end, I've done a row of stem stitches, and I'm going to bring that up to the camera in a minute so you can see the detail, and then I'm going to show you that I've done some extra rows of that same stitch in some different fibers. And now you can see I've actually added some more rows of stem stitch. Now we are starting stitch number 5, which is split stitch. So we come up through the fabric just like we did with all the other stitches, and we make a small stitch. And then what I come and do next is I go back halfway along the stitch and I push the needle in between the fiber. So I'm splitting it. I've got fibers on either side. I'll show you again. So I make a small stitch ahead. And this time when I come back up through the middle, you can see that I split the fibres. So I come up through the center of that stitch, split the fibres, and then I go forward and make another stitch, and I just keep doing it, coming up through the middle to split the fibres. Now when I'm talking about splitting the fibres, I mean that there are fibres on the left and the right of the needle. So come forward. What I find is easy is once you've done that small stitch ahead, you pull it through so your stitch lays flat, and then you can push the needle up in between that thread. Now I'm using a wool thread, which is pretty easy to split. A perlé cotton wouldn't be as easy to split because it's a little bit more tightly wound. Stranded cotton is also easy to split with stranded cotton, because if you're using 6 fibres, you'll end up splitting it pretty evenly with 3 fibres on one side, 3 fibres on the other side, like 3 strands on either side, if that makes sense. So I've sped up my video here, and I'm going to jump a little bit ahead just so you get an idea of what it looks like. I actually quite like the look of this split stitch in the wool, probably a little bit more than I like it in the stranded cotton. It's just a little bit neater. Again, good for stems, good for borders, things like that. So here we have our first 5 stitches. We've got our running stitch, our whipped running stitch, our back stitch, our stem stitch, and then finally our split stitch. So I've done some extra rows. I've actually used, so they're the kind of variegated cotton wools that I was talking about. I've actually done my stitches on the pencil dots, but then I've done extra lines in between. So I've added in extra just to get some practice. Now in Rachel's video, you're going to get some extra stitches, so 5 more stitches. We've got the cross stitch, we've got seed stitch. She's going to teach you a French knot, a colonial knot, and a pistol stitch. So these are the different ones. So that's the French knot there. That is seed stitch. These are colonial knots. And then this is pistol stitch. So it's kind of like a French knot at the end of a straight stitch. So I've got 2 samplers here done. I've got my one from the other day, and then the one that I did today, I've added in Rachel's stitches at the bottom. So there's our first 5 at the top that we did. And then I've done the French knots, the colonial knots, the crosses, which can be X's or crosses. It can go either way. And then, so the French knots are at the top, the colonial knots are underneath the crosses. Then I've got the pistol stitch, and I've done the little seed stitch at the bottom in a variegated thread again, so you can see different colours coming through. So hopefully you enjoy having a go at these stitches. If you're finding this overwhelming, don't worry. You don't have to master all of these stitches necessarily. You could just do the really simple running stitch and maybe back stitch, and then maybe you can do crosses or something like that. It doesn't matter if you can't do everything. So I've decided to make a title page for my journal, which I'm about to show you. It's still a work in progress, but this is using the stitches that we are going to be showing you this week and next week. So I'll go through it later and tell you what stitches they are. It's still a work in progress. I'm going to do some stitching on the fabric flowers at the top and bottom. And this is going to be the inside or first page inside my journal. Now this is an optional thing. You might want to do a title page. You might just want to go straight into your slow stitch blocks. Totally up to you. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this week's video and I'll see you next week. Bye.